time for marketing management. In this episode, we're going to be talking about business environment analysis. You can think of these sort of like some reality-based TV competitions like The Amazing Race or Survivor. In these shows, teams have to be really aware of the environments around them. It also highlights the importance of understanding who it is that you're bringing along with you. What do they bring to the table? What are their skill sets and dispositions? What are their needs? This highlights again that aspect of marketing that we first talked about in terms of customer segmentation and targeting. We have to know who we're bringing along with us to understand how we're going to be able to navigate that environment effectively. Customers can be some of our greatest allies, but we have to know what we're going to face and how to work with them in order to succeed together. Among the first things that we need to understand in business environment analysis are trends. What's going on out there in the marketplace that might affect us? And fortunately, there's a useful acronym that we have to prompt our thinking about the kinds of things we need to be concerned about. It's called PESTEL, and it stands for Political, Economic, Social, Technological, Environmental, and Legal Considerations. Now, some or all of these may apply at different times throughout the market. Some may affect you, some may not, and many of these will actually overlap under the same kind of considerations that we'll talk about in just a minute. The point is not for you to create some sort of segmented, bulleted list of things that you can just simply check off or show to other people. The point is to prompt you to think about the different kinds of things that are going on in the world now and potentially in the future that will affect your organization's success. PESTEL starts out with political concerns. And you may have noticed in the United States that depending on which political party happens to be in power at any given time, that there are greater or fewer numbers of regulations in different industries. As I'm sitting here filming this, we're actually on the precipice of the 2020 election, which is interesting because it will have some effect on businesses, and you can actually watch this in the stock market as different news unfolds. When we slow down and have recessions or depressions, spending slows down as well, which reduces the tax base, often prompting government action such as stimulus packages. Back to the fact that in marketing, we're always talking about people and perceptions. Social trends are also really critical in many industries. The rise of social media, smartphones, and the internet have fundamentally altered how people connect and communicate with each other, and also with brands. Also think about the impacts of COVID. Restaurants and gyms have had to shut down and reopen, increasing their cost to be able to do business, and also creating future social trend concerns that when all of the crisis abates, that people are just going to be used to the new normal and not come back to restaurants and not patronize gyms. However, this has been fantastic for food delivery services like Blue Apron and Uber Eats. It's been great for at-home workouts like Peloton and Les Mills. These trends may be great for one group and absolutely terrible for another. Technologies are constantly evolving as well. I just noted the smartphone and the rise of the social media. Blockchain that allows for virtual currency is also a technological trend. Big data and analytics and AI, these are all trends in the marketplace that are going to allow us to be more efficient and more effective at crunching information in the future. Environmental trends include the kinds of things that you might think, like going green, recycling, alternative fuel sources, but it also deals with the broader things that impact human life, such as lack of food or widespread disease. So of course, COVID would fall into this sort of category, but so would fires and droughts in Southern California. Because laws are created primarily by politicians, there is some tie between political and legal trends. However, legal trends tend to be a little bit more enduring. As a good example of this, the cigarette industry is not allowed to advertise on TV anymore. You're not allowed to smoke in restaurants, and you're not allowed to smoke on airlines. If you're R.J. Reynolds or Philip Morris, this is decidedly bad for you. If you're a class action lawyer, this is probably good for your business. In addition to environmental concerns, there are also competitors out there, and these pirates are trying to steal our booty. It's just like on the TV shows where everybody's trying to win. So how do you win? To help us think about these things, there's another acronym called SWOT. And this stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, strengths are obviously the things that you do well, and weaknesses are the things that you don't do well. For example, your company may be really good at manufacturing or producing things, but not very great at selling them. The key to strengths and weaknesses is that they are relative to competitors. Opportunities and threats may be distinct to your organization, such as the chance to have a partnership that no competitor is able to get, or they may apply more broadly to the entire industry, such as the threat of increased regulations. The best way that I've seen to think about SWOT is to think about the old story of David and Goliath. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, David was a shepherd back in Roman times who faced down and killed a giant Roman warrior named Goliath. But how did he do it? The interesting thing is it's a true classic underdog story where everyone thought David's not going to make it. He can't possibly win this. But if you actually analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the two opponents effectively, you'll see why Goliath was doomed from the very start and why David would have been the clear victor. Everybody thought that Goliath was going to win this thing, hands down. Why? He was a trained warrior, used to being in fights. He was also massive in size. David was just a scrawny little shepherd guy who had never been in a fight in his life, or so they thought. If you didn't know this, shepherds spend a lot of time protecting their flocks from fast-moving animals like wolves. This is why David had a slingshot and knew how to use it. Goliath expected David to just walk up to him and engage him in hand-to-hand combat as all of his previous opponents had done. David had agility and intelligence on his side. He refused to play Goliath's game and made up his own game, called "I'm going to put this rock through your head." Goliath was not a fast-moving guy. Hitting him probably would have been like hitting the broadside of a barn. He also probably suffered from symptoms of gigantism, like nearsightedness. So he actually needed David to get close to him in order to engage him in combat. This is how you want to think about competition in business. What are you good at that your competitors are not? What fight can you take to them? If they play a pricing game, you can play a superior service game. This is what differentiation is. Don't try to beat your competitors by playing their game. Beat them by being distinct. Another useful framework to keep in mind in terms of competition is called Porter's 5 Forces. Now, there's some aspects of it like buyer power and supplier power that we'll get into more in distribution. We've already touched on direct competition a little bit in this segment, but we also need to think about the threat of new entrants, new competitors coming into the marketplace and how easy that is, and also the threat of substitute offerings. Some industries are just simply easier to get into than others. Think about how hard it is to start up a new car company. Tesla had a lot of capital put into it to be able to start up. And there aren't that many car companies out there at this point. Now you think about the app market and the millions of apps that are out there. It's a relatively low barrier to entry. In fact, so low that kids as young as 11 years old are producing apps and putting them online for money. In addition to the threat of new entrants, there's also the threat of substitutes outside of your direct industry. Let's think about Red Bull again for just a second. Who's Red Bull's competition? Monster Energy? NOS? 5 Hour Energy? Yes, these are the direct competitors. But they have indirect competition coming from gyms and sleep aids. Anything out there that will help provide somebody with that extra kick of energy that they need that is not Red Bull or a caffeinated beverage like Red Bull is an indirect competitor to them. Let's talk with an industry expert from the financial services sector to see how she analyzes the market and determines who her competitors are. Welcome to the show, Ellie Polanco, current CEO of Novello, which is a financial services company, right, in the financial services space. Spent 10 years at JP Morgan doing product development and a number of other things. We're kind of here to talk about understanding and navigating the business environment, kind of seeing the business writing on the wall. And there's a lot of people out there, I think, who would fancy themselves as John Paulson back in 2008, where, he saw the financial crisis looming from the housing market and, benefited from that greatly. So being able to see the writing on the wall in the market is a critical thing in product development and in really any business operations. So you've got some experience in the financial tech space. Obviously, things like blockchain, virtual currency, and the like are big, kind of looming or up and coming, and have been for a while. How did you kind of see this? How did you see these technologies developing? How did you see the business writing on the wall?
So what my role at JP Morgan was interesting because we worked in the research and development department. So we had to be looking at not what the situation is today, but what it's going to look like in 5-10 years. And by anticipating it, we could start building the solutions that would sort of ensure that we were still competitive then. And so the success of my role really entailed identifying those early signals. By far, the best signaling for me came directly from our clients. So hearing from, and my clients at JP Morgan were large companies, large banks, large governments, anyone that was moving money in large chunks. My product, my bread and butter has always been payments and how we move money between accounts. And so the first signal usually comes from clients who start to see patterns in pain points that they have. If you look at surveys or from client interviews, usability testing, you start to hear things like, hey, don't understand why it takes so long to send a payment from X to B. Don't understand why the fees are not transparent. Why is it so expensive? Why is it not accessible? And these this feedback, at the end of, as you go along, because you're wearing your hat of what does this mean for 5 years from now, you start to get a sense of what's going to drive change. At the end of the day, what drives change is what clients are willing to pay. So for me, that core of what clients were saying was super important. And obviously there are, I was working at JP Morgan, and therefore I had access to some of the sort of largest defining client bases, right? I was talking to folks like Microsoft, IBM, Airbnb, the Bank of China, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England. And so that was awesome, just having an access to those rooms and just having those discussions. What works for you today, what doesn't? And then I took that away and matched it with what was going on in technology. In the world of finance, a lot of the fixes to those issues are really being enabled by technology. Things that allow you to make things cheaper, more accessible, less friction. And for that, again, at that point, we had to figure out what is working in technology, what's greenfield in technology. We ourselves at JP Morgan, we're not a technology company, so my ability to merge this signals from clients on what they'll need 5 to 10 years from now with the technology that's going to be available today to start building really entails keeping a pulse with the builders in this space. These were sort of thought leaders from the academic community and engineering community that were experimenting with the technology. And so that entailed, going to a lot of, honestly, academic conferences. There's a lot of, for example, crypto economic conferences that are really the only way to have, an actual discussion about whether tech A or B is better for what.
Interesting.
We had linkages to, actually, I helped set up a partnership with Cornell Tech in New York, which had a sort of crypto unit of folks that were researching in that department. So we could hop on the call with sort of a professor with PhD students looking at greenfield and saying, what does this work, does this doesn't? So industry reports to go to, and for you to really have an edge of information, you have to go to the folks that are experimenting with it, and that's where, folks communicate. So that was my role, like getting a pulse from the clients and what was needed, and again, how business dynamics would change, and then getting a pulse on technology to really try to blend what was going to be feasible and start building on that.
Those are fantastic points. I mean, and something we talk a lot about in marketing is differentiation. And you just brought up a really great point. If there's just an industry report out there and everybody's got access to it, there's nothing unique and you can't beat your competitors in the space. But with your own clients and going to the experts in the field, which, by the way, I'm sure the PhDs and the PhD students were thrilled to be able to have somebody to give them data that they could research and then write papers on, right? Because that's all we do. Win-win. But yeah, so these unique places and having to go online to Reddit and really dig for information that is not just readily available is a fantastic point. So there's this mecca of AI, artificial intelligence thing going on, right? I kind of prepped you that this question would be coming. So where is the market in terms of AI, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people understand exactly what AI is. I mean, we see movies, that have AI and it's robots walking around acting like human beings and things like that. But where is the market in terms of being able to deliver on the promise of AI? What does it kind of mean right now, and where do you think it's heading?
I think AI has been sort of super interesting in an evolving field, and there's still a lot to come from it. And I like to think of it as waves, whereas the first wave really came, in terms of implementing AI, really came, I want to say 2010 to 2015, we saw like a really an acceleration of products coming to market where it was all about automating and looking at things where a lot of people were doing it, but and it was very costly because you would have 100 people doing the same thing in a repetitive way. And the first sort of instance of business uplift in AI was coming in and saying, hey, you could do the same thing with half like that staff, because this helps you automate that repetitive behavior. So there was that whole wave was about automation and looking at sort of repetitive tasks that are easy to code and making and automating that, which inevitably reduces the amount of sort of operators that you need to have doing something. I think the second wave of AI has really been around, forget just repetition. If there's something that AI can give us, an insight that is better than what a human being is capable of doing right now. And that's where you saw the growth of things like IBM's Watson machine and this probabilistic nature of sort of predictability features and signals, where you would apply it to situations where predicting the future was important, and the ability to ingest a lot of data that a human being couldn't ingest on their own was really the edge to make better decisions. So that's the second wave, and I think that's the wave we're in now. It's really about getting better insights because you can churn through data faster and bigger and in better ways. And I think what's coming now with the third wave, which is a thing that I'm like seeing live, is this understanding that this isn't necessarily a zero-sum game where it's like AI or humans. And,
and they're going to take over the world at some point. Yeah.
Exactly. But like there's been a lot more focus of, this concept of human in the loop machine learning or human in the loop AI, which is really about the symbiotic relationship between humans and AI, so that AI, just under the understanding that the best way to ensure adaptability to what humans need AI to do is to incorporate an operator, a human, in pivoting and forking the tech as it goes along. So that includes creating workflows where AI makes the first decision, but then gets filtered or curated by a human before it actually ends up, doing its goal. And that's still mostly, there's a lot of like research implementations. I think there's a lot of promise in what that could do over the next, like what I'm calling the third wave.
And that second wave, I mean, is that consistent with kind of the stuff that Facebook does with, getting better and better algorithms to analyze, individuals' posts and who they're related to and be able to serve them up, advertising messages distinctly?
Yeah, absolutely. There's stuff around, in terms of this ability of a machine to ingest more data immediately for immediate insight. So Facebook, for example, uses things, even like natural language processing and sentiment analysis, which is looking at what folks are writing, getting a sense of whether they're feeling positive or negative, or what the feeling is there, what they're trying to sort of convey, and doing it not for one person but a billion people at the same time, and immediately getting a pulse of, okay, what is happening in this area, this region, this space. That's pretty meaningful, and that would be fairly impossible for a company to be able to do if they would only, if they were only using humans. So it's absolutely a good example of how you can find an edge in business by using AI, because it gives you this ability to almost use, it's this concept of better data, because it's data enriched with insights because of your ability to manipulate and read it faster.
Yeah. So are there other technologies? I mean, I mentioned a couple here just to get the ball rolling, but there are other technologies out there that you're seeing that are kind of up and coming that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about fintech, so financial technology, and I would say that the name of the game in that space is openness. And so what clients want, the demand that's coming, is this idea of open access to financial technology, whether that's a savings account, an investment product, payment rails. The way that the financial infrastructure has been set up for the last hundreds of years have really started with the assumption that depository institutions and governments are the stewards of access to financial services, and all this clunky old infrastructure was built under those assumptions. Relatively well if the only principles in a environment are two banks talking to each other, but do not work really well when you have companies like, a Venmo, a Square app, or Robinhood trying to sort of create a new interface for clients with additional access. And so a lot of what's shaping the financial tech space is creating infrastructure that opens stuff up. And to that end, the APIs, so application programming interfaces, are huge right now. These are essentially really nimble mechanisms for you to embed services to anyone, in anyone's system. So going from, hey, you need to spend 8 months to download and code a platform for you to be able to, say, do risk analysis, now you can say, hey, use an API, just deploy this 2 lines of code into your system, and we can get up and running by the end of the day. That's huge. That enhances openness. Cloud infrastructure, it's been here for a while, but that's really been an accelerant, which is, again, this ability to perform things on behalf of others and deploy it over cloud, reduces the cost of setting things up, of creating new products and offering new services.
It also helps with housing of videos.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've run out of space on every computer I have, so it's all going box right now.
The cost of data storage is it used to be so, even in 2012, I would be building things at JP Morgan, and half of the projects you couldn't really make it work from a unit economics perspective. And I was doing a lot of AI stuff at that time because of the storage costs of doing it all on premise, which, within 3 years, that was already like a consideration that was gone, and it really impacted a lot of value. So it's really meaningful. So cloud technology, API technology, both I think have been are creating 10x type change today. More things are coming to the table by more types of people because those two things exist. And those are pretty foundational, like infrastructure stuff. It's like kind of not sexy to talk about, but it's really what's driving.
Well, no, but I mean, it allows for speed, right? I mean, and everything is about going faster and faster and faster because everybody wants things, quicker and quicker and quicker.
Yeah, exactly.
So have there been any impacts of COVID? I mean, there are a lot of other industries, restaurants, gyms, things like that have been hit pretty substantially by COVID. Has COVID had any impact in financial services?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a couple of ways. One is the move to digital, whereas cash, for example, and checks were a part of everyday life for a lot of people. It's really created a bottleneck in folks' ability to access and use paper money. So it was sort of like a push for a lot of people to need to figure out, okay, how do I get, a virtual card, a bank account where I can do electronic deposits, all of these things that have really sort of decreased the need for any sort of companies that rely on paper money, and increase the use of companies that rely on electronic money. So things like, as I mentioned, Venmo, for example, neobanks like Chime, and so that push to digital has been huge. And probably things that we would have seen happening in 5 years are being built and deployed right now because it's accelerated that demand. On the other end, though, it's also increased the level of risk, fraud, scam, attacks in the system. So there's been a huge push to really tackle the cybersecurity angle of the digital financial infrastructure, which is what my company does. But when you look at cyber criminals and hackers and scammers, their targets are really important critical systems, because they want to see failure and panic and chaos, or they want to see profit, so they're also tackling systems that have a lot of money. And that means looking at digital financial systems, looking for vulnerabilities. So you've seen there's been over 400x increase in the level of scams associated with things like let's say, just to give you an example, digital payment of benefits to folks. Usually whether you're dealing with your employer or with the state government or federal government, Gavin can say, hey, this is Gavin, this is my account, send me the money that I've earned here. Cyber criminals during COVID have, because they know that a lot more folks are receiving certain types of checks from very identified places like the government or
unemployment,
or the unemployment tax, they've actually hacked into those systems to do things like account takeover and synthetic identity scams where they say, hey, I'm Gavin. I no longer bank here. I bank here. Send me all this money here. And you, Gavin, never know. And they are creating synthetic identities in those departments, but also rerouting money that should be sent to you to them. And these types of attacks are not just happening to folks like you, like individuals, but they're also happening wholesale, and folks are attacking banks. So there's more attacks to banks, more attacks to any institution that holds a lot of sort of money routing capabilities.
So you're promoting that people get computer science degrees so that they can. That's a way better way to make money than what we do. It's illegal, kids. It's illegal.
It really is, and it's interesting. That's it's a great sort of anecdote for the pros and cons of innovation, right? You've got increased access because now you can literally access money that you've earned with your phone, or which is actually easier to do than needing to open a bank account or go to the bank and get a checkbook, things like that. But then it's also created more potential victims of fraud and cyber threat. And those things aren't growing at the same pace. The digital push and then the risk protection. So it's an interesting balance that's happening right now, or that we're hoping to help create.
Yeah, I mean, 12 months ago, all the companies were pulling people back in and going, "We're not doing remote working. This is garbage." And then all of a sudden, COVID hits and everybody go home. And now people are going, "I don't know that we're ever going back to work." Because if we're going to spend years getting used to this, right, then that becomes the new trend, the new way that we do business. Thinking about, governments and regulations and fraud protection and all this kind of stuff, what have you seen in terms of government responses, political response? I mean, there's the obvious one, like with Uber, where this whole new thing comes up in the sharing economy. No one knows how to deal with it. So, legislators wait for a while and then all of a sudden just try to lay the hammer on what they are and are not allowed to do. So in terms of what you've seen in product development, what kinds of trends or responses have you seen from government, regulatory agencies or whatever, and how have you had to kind of navigate that?
Yeah, honestly, and that's the other thing, like, again, as it relates to financial services, regulation is a heavy, sort of a heavy parameter to always, like, it's very much linked to what is allowed or not with innovation, which is great, like, folks need protection. However, this is another example where innovation is moving faster than government regulation. And,
shocker.
Yeah, and I've actually I saw examples of this both with AI and both in my work with crypto, where I felt like sort of the slowness in researching and keeping up to date with this technology was actually impeding innovation. And I would do this type of work and try to deploy it in the U.S. and also in places like Singapore or places like England. And it really makes a difference how governments look at and keep up with that trend. Like, if you look at Singapore as a sort of foil for the U.S., like, they move at 10x speed when it comes to, okay, let's look at this particular technology and let's define what actually is the risk that it brings to citizens and what we're willing to, and like making an intelligent sort of, not intelligent, but nuanced research decision about what is allowed or not as it's getting built in the first or second year of its first implementation. Whereas in the U.S., as we saw with AI and crypto, this was maybe like 5 to 10 years after, and we're still in that space with crypto. So I remember having to work with the OCC, which does a lot of supervision for banks around how they move money, and working with them to help them understand why AI could be an enabler of identifying things like money laundering and sanction screening violations, human trafficking, helping us identify things like human trafficking, financing, terrorist financing, mass weapons proliferation, that we could be better if we use those tools. And back in 2012, 2013, that was all forbidden. You could not use any of that stuff. So it took us like a couple of years of working with the government to say, like, let's do experiments together and let's show empirically how it could be used for the better. And now AI for sort of Bank Secrecy Act type of protections, AML protection is the norm, but it took a while and it was costly. And now with crypto, the whole concept of blockchain, of Bitcoin, for example, it was this idea that the money movement world needed to be more open, and regional-based rules, like border-based rules of U.S., for example, versus England, should not be the norm. They actually created a global financial structure where there was no government creating the rules, where their hope was that was going to be a mechanism for folks that did not have access to that were underbanked or unbanked for socioeconomic or political reasons to be able to access sort of really basic rights of ability to pay for rent and ability to make money, which I think everyone can agree, like, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But
it also enables some bad things.
yeah, yeah. And so, the Bitcoin white paper came up in 2018. Since 2018, up until like this year, you talk to anyone in the government, it's like, oh no, nothing related to Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin, crypto, blockchain. That is a criminal endeavor. Like, there's like not really non-nuanced approach to it. And it really interesting, like you asked the question with COVID, but I remember seeing the stimulus package sort of conversations in the House of Representatives as they were trying to define how we have an issue, we need people to get access to this money. The infrastructure rails that exist are not good for that. We are going to miss out on like 20%, 30% of Americans if we use those rails. What could we do? And, you've had clauses, and I mean, this is the first time I saw it, where now they were talking about, hey, what if we use blockchain to create a digital bank account backed by the Fed or something like that? And then we can like send it to everyone's phone app. How amazing would that be? And folks, in banks that have been working with this for a while are like, yeah, we talked about this in 2011, 2012. We would have that ready and we would have talked about it. And I think it's interesting because there's actually been a lot of studies that talk about how, and it's usually called compliance regulation in finance, which is the law that you need to abide to make sure that you're not adding risk to the system. They've mapped out, for example, the pool of transactions that sort of are found, the bad behavior that's found via compliance, and the actual bad behavior that exists. And those two circles don't really converge in a meaningful way.
That's interesting.
Which just points to there being a lot of inefficiencies around the objective of regulation, which is stopping, protecting citizens and ensuring efficiency in markets, and the actual bad behavior that's causing inefficiency. So I think that's interesting how that's going to evolve, and hopefully we'll move to a spot that's closer to folks like Singapore, folks like Israel, honestly, even spots in Latin America, like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil. There are some governments that are really really trying to meaningfully explore ways of how they use technology to innovate without and using regulation as an enabler and not a hindrance. And I'm really interested to see how it plays out. We're still right in the middle of that, and it could be a never-evolving fight.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see what the catalysts are, what are the drivers in those different countries, right? I mean, it's just interesting to think about. Well, there's completely different societies,
Totally. I mean, when you look at Israel, a lot of the stuff is really about defense, as you would expect. Like, a lot of the triggers of why certain sort of and by the way, not all is done. I mean, there's a nuance to this. I think thinking of a world with no regulation is not good. I mean, folks, when you give them the leeway, will do bad things. And so this is a nuanced, multidisciplinary type of conversation that involves like economics, technology, ethics, and it's interesting how it'll play out.
What are sort of the social trends that are driving some of these technologies to be more effective? I mean, privacy concerns, talking about people doing wrongdoing, so fear of technology, a lot of that abating as we have more and more tech and generations age out where, they're not as tech savvy. But what are some of the social considerations that are trending, impacting the effectiveness of these technologies?
Yeah, right now, I mean, you called one out really well, which is the right to privacy, and which is actually seeing a trend in the use of cryptography methods, and that's actually a big part of what cryptography. But and this idea of you should own your own data and have a right to privacy of that data as it moves around in the world. And there's a lot of tech around data sharing protocols and masking protocols, privacy protocols that are aiming to enable it. But that's one social demand that was not really prominent even 5 years ago, beyond just like, hackers and anarchists. And now it's just like everyone really, because of all the hacks that have happened and the data breaches, and you really understand that your data is an asset, but also as a human being, you have a right to protect that data, and it shouldn't be something that you give off to corporations, and that corporations, just because they're providing you a service, should have the right to view everything about you. That's definitely something that is creating a lot of change right now at every industry level. The other is really this idea of inclusion. I think for a long, and again, I thinking a lot through the lens of financial health, right, and financial technology, but for a long time, the idea of accessing the unbanked and underbanked, so folks that don't have a bank account or that are not serviced with enough sort of tools to be able to access the banking system. There's been a neglect to that for a really long time. And I think, again, like in the last 5 to 10 years, there's really been a growth in setting that as a key priority for folks of all levels. Folks finally hearing those voices, and it just has grown in pace with the change in our society and what we care about and what we want to build. But I think those two things have been really prominent, are still really prominent, and I think it's going to give rise to some really good things. It's harder to make tech, to build tech with more parameters. It takes a little more creativity in the design, but it's awesome because these are ethical concerns, and you need to think about that from day zero. And a lot of people haven't, so I think it's great, and I'm excited to see what those build with those parameters.
Right? Yeah. So circling back to competition for a minute, I mean, you talked a little bit about working at JP Morgan, and one of the things I talk about in this segment is the old David versus Goliath story. And most would probably picture, JP Morgan as being a Goliath type organization. I mean, massive financial institution, but you're talking mainly about the innovation aspect and beating competitors from an innovation standpoint. So I'm wondering, thinking about JP Morgan as sort of an innovator in the tech space. So thinking about competition, right? So you're this bank, JP Morgan, massive financial institution, thinking about them as David versus Goliath and kind of being a Goliath type organization. Do you feel like it's more important to have that innovative edge in competition or to just simply be large?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think what's interesting again in financial technology is that you have this thing of regulation and government that actually acts as a barrier to entry for a lot of the smaller players. Like a big protection that incumbents have in a way is regulation. For example, right now the only institutions that are able to have a contract with the Federal Reserve, really like have access to dollars, are large banks of a certain size to protect, but also that means that they're the only ones that can profit for it, right? Like they're the only ones that can issue loans and things like that. That's something that was created, I think, in the 30s and taken as law. But one of the interesting conversations that happened in the past month with the Paycheck Protection Plan and how to get folks these small business loans that they need, and seeing that large banks were a bottleneck. They weren't accepting applications, reviewing applications, and smaller players like Square, like Chime, they were like, hey, hold up, we're here, we're able. Can we get access to this rail? And the government said yes, which was huge. That's huge.
That's surprising.
People realize how they don't necessarily yet have access to the actual Fed accounts, but they have more access than they had before. And it started a conversation that a few years ago would not have been possible. But just to say that in regulated industries, there is, this is, as it relates to banks, regulation actually favors the larger banks. And the other thing really, as it relates to something like AI, where having access to large data sets, so almost like the input distribution or output distribution of your services, obviously a large network gives you an edge. But where you win out in being a smaller player is your ability to move faster. Like it takes 2 years to build and release a new product at JP. When you're a small startup, you can do it in a month, right? And bring it out to market.
That's because y'all don't sleep.
I know. And like if you're really delighting your customers, it could really give you an edge. And so you can test new concepts really fast and really and test out new technologies really fast. So it's pros and cons. I think with fintech, it's still very much, I think, to me, one of the biggest dynamics in the space that define who wins out is still regulation, where the bigger players are very much insulated from challengers because of this access that is mandated by law to be given to them. And that's why you have even new entrants where when you look at folks like Venmo, for example, let me give you an example. There's two big innovations that have happened that have been started by small companies. One is peer-to-peer payments. The other is like Bitcoin, right? And crypto exchanges. Peer-to-peer payments, which folks like PayPal, Venmo really created, and even crypto, neither one could go anywhere if they themselves did not have a bank to sponsor them. Like banks actually have to sponsor smaller startups in the financial space if they're going to move money, because by law that needs to happen. So,
a big part of your success as a small fintech company is whether or not you find a bank partner, which is so oxymoronic. And so folks in the peer-to-peer payment space, they found a partner really fast. And so that feature grew really fast, backed by literally you just need one bank to back you. And then you can create this feature that can actually compete with other larger banks. But when it came to crypto, not really only this year, you started to see in the U.S. sort of larger sponsorship by larger banks. No one was a taker. And that is a key sort of barrier to entry, the need to be sponsored by a bank to do things like move money around, access the settlement rails of the Federal Reserve. It's so oxymoronic. And if I look at where we'll be in like 20 years, I think there's going to be a big shift there. It's still a long ways to go, but it's just, from an economic perspective, it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
But yeah, that's like an interesting competitive dynamic that I think you see a lot in the financial industry, the healthcare industry, the energy industry. So things where the government has a more sort of embedded role in supervising what happens.
So thinking about competition, are there other ways that you assess competitors out there in the market space? Do you look at classic strengths and weaknesses, or do you sit there and try and just outrun them on innovation?
No, I look at their strengths and weaknesses. I focus on what I'm doing, but I think the positioning of my product and what it gives versus what others give, entails competitive intelligence. For the larger players that I'm competing with, there's a lot of info out there. They're out there talking to press, writing, releasing, public filings. Their customers are writing feedback online. So easy to find information about what they're doing and what their gaps are. When it comes to other challengers, other new entrants, I try to establish a relationship with my competitors' management team, and we try to get together every quarter and talk about what's happening and get a sense of where they're at. Also keeping, again, a pulse in the market, talking to industry influencers as well, wherever they are, whether that's Twitter or Reddit or conferences. But yeah, it's an evolving thing, and it's not something you do once and forget it. It's iterative, and the approach changes depending on the size of the competitor.
So you're saying that you have kind of a cooperative, competitive strategy. You cooperate with your competitors from time to time and just kind of figure out how to look at the market collectively?
Not how I mean, it's, and we're talking about folks that are 1 year into their company, but like are building for a similar vision, where the one thing that you have in common is that you want to change the game in a meaningful way. There's like a huge market shift that we're all working together in defining. And so
there's a big pie that's available for all of you to get into.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And it's more about, getting a sense of what they're going through, like what are the big challenges that they're seeing, what are the big opportunities, and obviously folks are not sharing everything, but it starts to, it's a casual conversation, not like a consortium in any way that's defined, where I just want to make sure I know what folks are building. So there's no sort of contract, there's no real partnership. It's us
Sure.
as builders in the space, thinking through the changing dynamics in the market, especially as all challengers. We're all challengers here. We're all trying to change the status quo in some way. And so we're hitting against similar barriers, and sometimes it helps to think through it with someone else that's going through it too.
Gotcha. So you've got a degree in economics. One of my questions is, what has been the value in having a degree in economics in terms of being able to do the product development, to be able to see the business writing on the wall, to understand the environment that you're having to navigate?
Yeah, I think the beauty of economics, I think, is that it talks about the incentives of people, like what brings you utility, is what you're willing to pay for. And that really also should be the driver of any entrepreneur, I think, build something that people want. And so I think economics gives you the frameworks and tools to think about that in a meaningful way and really evaluate and go for opportunities where incentives align with what's being built, and that transferred to more business terms, that is thinking through the unit economics of how you're going to price a new subscription tooling, or or actually it even goes further than that. Like when it comes to blockchain and crypto, you're not just building a product yourself. It's about building a network where you set the rules where, for example, 100 nodes in that network work together to make sure that there's an efficient market goal. And when you're coding that program, you actually have to think back about the economic incentives of each node to make sure that goal is met. So it's been super helpful. It's been super helpful from like deciding what to build, making what you build profitable and assigning prices to that build, to actually getting the weeds and building product that scale, because you're thinking always about incentives aligning and reaching efficiency of a market. So it's been awesome. It's been really helpful to me, and even more tactical in AI, just looking at some of the stuff that we did with microeconomics at WNL. That was my entry point into becoming a product manager in AI back in 2011, 2012. Just understanding the sort of stats plus regression, that's half of the game.
So you guys pay attention. That's regression. Important.
Yeah. Yeah. So that at the end of the day is the core of what's happening with AI, and learning it at a foundational level from econ gave me the base from which I could become that product manager. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, Ellie Polanco, thank you so much for spending your time with us today and giving us your insights in business. All the best for a happy and prosperous 2020.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Some sage words of advice. So remember to keep yourselves up to date so that you'll wind up being David and not Goliath when the time comes to compete. In the next episode, we'll talk through distribution and those other couple of aspects of Porter's 5 forces. Until then, Seacrest out. In this episode, we're going to be talking about business environmental analysis. Among the first things that we really need to understand in business environmental often coupled. Now, when we experience widespread if you're R.J. Reynolds or Philip Morris, this is likely bad for your business. If you're a Claxat, the key to strengths and weaknesses, let's talk with an industry expert in the financial services sector to see how. Let's talk with an industry expert in the financial services sector to see how Sally sells seashells by the seashore. Okay. Sally sells seashells. See some seashells by the seashore. Okay. Seashells. Now I'm going to say seashells instead of what I'm supposed to say. Let's talk with an industry expert. We're going to talk with an expert. Seashells, expert. No, stop saying seashells. Services sector. Okay. All right, let's get it together. Get it together, Fox. Let's talk with a financial